second session on the book For the Life of the World, Toward the Social Ethos of the Orthodox Church. Today we'll be talking about the second section, which is called The Church in the Public Sphere. But just a few notes beforehand. It is the second of a 10-part series. Most of you will be aware, many of you were here last week. We will record it, and those recordings will be made available as we go on. I think kind of towards the end of each week, but we will let you know when and where to access those recordings exactly. It will be via David Goa's website, which is the same way that one can sign up to get alerts, reminders, or future news for events like this. So davidgoa.ca, the newsletter there might be something you wish to sign up for. Okay, in general, it's best if everyone keep their volume muted and their video on, if you will. Unless you'd like to speak or it's a conversation time, then we welcome and indeed encourage thinking together. There will be presentations or talks, some prepared ideas at the beginning of each session, but the thinking together, the conversational aspect of it, is where we want our focus to land most heavily, most sturdily. So why don't we begin recording now? And David will lead us into this second part of the book, The Course of Human Life. And thank you all for being here once again. Please, David.
Yeah, it's good to see you all. The church in the public sphere. This has always been a little bit of a knotty issue in the history of the church. And you can think of it even in larger terms. It's a part of that whole question of what is the place of religion within the public sphere. So Andrew laid down a set of concepts for us to keep in mind last week, things for us to keep in mind as we think about the various themes and issues. We talked about points of reference, criteria, about custom and tradition, about melody and tone, and about ethos. And given that the Christian church is founded on the gospel, the glad tidings that God is love, and we do not need to fear. So this issue and theme of religion and public life has been one that has engaged me in a pretty direct way for quite a number of years. And I've often noted, as I've paid attention to these issues in our society, as well as in other parts of the world, that so often when an issue of religion and public life cross paths with each other, we often tend to get the worst religious rhetoric and the worst civil rhetoric as well, instead of finding the deepest and most compelling ways to think together about these matters. So in this, today, we'll be talking about a number of these matters, the issues of religious freedom and relationship to government, patriotism, racism, the whole issue of human rights and when certain rights collide with other rights, pluralism, the secular. So it's an area where I think most of us have been forced to ponder at times. So in the book, For the Life of the World, it kind of lays out a foundation for how Orthodox people should think about these matters. But I also think this is important for all Christians, and each part of the Christian tradition has, of course, thought about these things often in quite particular ways. I also think it's of value for those that do not identify with the Christian tradition, because most of us care, and many care deeply, for these issues when they present themselves to us. Christian hope lies in what the Christian church has often talked about, because it's a biblical phrase, as the kingdom of God. I often think about it as the commonwealth of God. What is the commonwealth that is bequeathed to us as we have understood it in the Christian tradition? That hope does not lie in politics or in ethnicity or culture, first and foremost, as important as those things may be. So Christian hope lies in the commonwealth of God and not in the kingdoms of this world. There's a Latia in the Orthodox liturgy, a little
can you go on your computer?
A little petition, which we chant, which is, "Put not your faith in princes, in the sons of men, in whom there is no salvation. For when their breath departs, all their plans become as dust." It's a haunting reminder that as important as politics is, as important as leadership is, we must always seek to understand its transitory nature, but rather to put one's hope in the whole meaning of the incarnation and the meaning of Jesus Christ, the anointed one, the one who expresses the fullness of the divine and the fullness of the human nature. And the one that in the Christian tradition is understood to help us come to that kind of freedom from various forms of behavior and practices, various kinds of sin, ways of missing the mark, oppression, violence that often characterizes our world. So what do we mean by the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world? I'm going to, plant a few questions as we move along here, and we can raise them and think about them together. One of the values of this notion, to my mind, is that it is suggesting that there is a perspective that one can hold above the fray. One does not have to be buried in the fray. And if in fact you are not buried in the fray, you have some chance of being a bit more open to the range of things that is taking place in your life and in our common life in the world. So Christians, as I'm sure most of you know, have lived under all different kinds of governments, empires, totalitarian regimes, liberal democracies. They've lived in nations where Christianity is established, that is part of the state. The Swedes lived like that until the year 2000. And then in a charming and very Swedish act in the year 2000, they decided to give Jesus Christ a birthday present. And that birthday present was to disestablish the church. Christians have also lived in states where there's other established religions. In fact, lots of Orthodox people these days live in states where the established religion is Islam or Judaism, for example, in Israel. In various periods of time, states have been amicable towards the institutional church. Sometimes they've been hostile towards it, and often in our world, somewhat indifferent. no matter what those circumstances are, it has been the habit within those that serve the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom to always pray for those who govern. So for example, here in Canada, it would go, and for Queen Elizabeth and her government, that she may rule in peace and justice. And we follow that very quickly with Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, which is a lovely way of saying, may their governance be anointed with the oil of gladness. But it is interesting when you think of the Orthodox tradition that this prayer was said, in all likelihood, also under the persecution of one of the finest of emperors, and perhaps thus one of the most ferocious in persecuting Christians, because he saw the danger in the so-called Galilean madness. Diocletian. So imagine in that period, Christians gathering and saying, and for Diocletian and his empire, that they may rule in peace and justice. And imagine after 1453, when the walls of Constantinople are finally breached and the great Turkish military leader enters the city and conquers it. And when they gathered, it no longer was to the Christian emperor that they prayed that prayer, but rather to the conqueror, that they may rule in peace and justice. And more recently and closer to home, Joseph Stalin and the persecutions in Russia. No matter what the circumstance, one is always to hold them up and to pray that they may rule in peace and justice. An important foundational stone of this document, and certainly of this section, is that the church as a church is gathered fundamentally in thanksgiving, an act of thanksgiving and praise, to let all earthly cares go behind me a little bit. Let me give my attention and my regard to gratitude and regard for the wonder of life. And in the hope that all those things that are difficult in life will be healed. There's a sense in which the church does not have a conservative or a liberal polity. And I think that this, of course, works itself out differently in all the great religions of the world. But it is striking to me that in so many of the great religions of the world, there is some ways of trying to rise above ideological fraternities and vested interests. The Christian polity is fundamentally, we use a lovely Greek word for this, Eucharistic, thanksgiving. It's a polity of thanksgiving. It's a polity which seeks to point beyond the enmities, beyond those things that divide us in ways that are harmful, to the unfolding of a newness of life, where those things which divide us will be healed, where indeed all of creation will be transfigured, and we will see it in its glory and wonder. So the insight that the stance of thanksgiving and the reorientation of our vision to one of regard for the wonder of life is absolutely central within the best of the church, what it does in its liturgy. But the church is also a prophetic sign. As you know, in the Hebrew Bible, we have both the priestly as well as the prophetic dimensions of the religious life of the Hebrews and of the Jews. So the church as a prophetic sign, it both has a critique of political regimes insofar as they fall short of loving communion, insofar as they fall short of doing what can be done so that justice reigns down, so that righteousness is restored, so that human beings come to live well with each other. But this prophetic sign is also one which says that all party pre-politics, whether from the left or from the right, from the progressive side or from some kind of quasi-fascism, all party pre-politics is not paying enough attention, not open enough to what is unfolding in life, what is seeking to be born, the kingdom that is coming, to use that lovely biblical phrase. So this prophetic stance suggests that Christians are to hold lightly to these political dimensions of life. We are strangers and pilgrims. We are people that are on the way. We are not bound, first and foremost, to what is, but we are seeking what is unfolding in a life of peace and a life of communing love. At the same time, the Orthodox Church does not judge all forms of government as equivalent, but sees all forms of government, all forms, as fragile, partial, broken, and that we are called to exercise our good judgment around every kind of institutional corruption and totalitarianism, around all ways in which governments and other organizations participate in mass suffering and oppression. In that sense, Christian citizens are not to submit to the powers, the social and political orders that harm. We have a couple naughty scriptures that are often used by Christians for ideological purposes as well. Christ spoke of acknowledging the right of civil authorities, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to regard those who are in authority, who are authorized to ensure the peace in the society. That's there in the gospel. In the writings of Paul, we have to remember that everything that Paul says is said in the context of the fledgling people of the way, the fledgling Christian communities, being under an imperial regime. And so Paul speaks about what it means to be subject under that kind of framework, but he tells us little about how to act once the political regime claims to be Christian. And this is a common, very common tragedy, I think, in the history of the Christian communities. I was reading recently a little book on Gaza, one of the cities of civilization, and about the bishop Porphyry, who became the first bishop of Gaza, and how when he was coming to Gaza, Gaza was still a pagan town. This is the 5th century, was still largely a pagan town. That is a town, I use pagan in the strict sense, a town where most of the people still engaged in a high regard for the emperor and for Greek imperial perspectives. So when he came to the town, he was met by people who, I guess, threw rotten eggs and oranges at him and called him out because he was one of these people they knew who was promoting what they called the Galilean craziness. How in the world could you love your enemy as yourself? That is the Galilean craziness. What's tragic about this story, and of course, so many others, as soon as the emperor becomes a strong Christian emperor, alas, alas, what goes around comes around. And the bishop exercises his authority and power then with the support of the state to do to the pagans what they had did to him. There's no question about this in the history of the church, and it goes on. It exists in our own day as well. Another text is the text of Christ cleansing the temple. Define both temple authorities, define the police power of the day in Palestine, and also going against that universal ordinance against civil disobedience that existed in the Roman Empire. So Christians are called to live and to offer peace, to live peacefully, to offer peace, and to call forth peace. Even so, the church remains, in some sense, always somewhat alien, a kind of alien presence within any and all human orders. Now, Christians also must and often participate in political order. But their call is to do so, not in terms of the way of the world, but in service to justice and to mercy. The hearkening to God's kingdom, the hearkening to the healing that can take place between people, speaking to the presence of the kingdom through their love and solidarity, through their expression of hope for what is unfolding, for the coming of a fuller sense of communion relationships with everyone. So there's a sense that Christians have a higher citizenship, one which also positions them for civil disobedience when faced with profound injustice. All political alliances, conservative, liberal, all of them, are meant to be provisional, transient, partial, and incidental. They're all to be held in that fashion. So I suggest to you, this is not in the document, that there is no political Christian position, either conservative or liberal. I suggest that to you. We can come back to it. When the society accords its citizens a fundamental dignity of liberty and to seek good ends, we know people are blessed. And we should be grateful for the very best in democratic forms of society, which have done that to some extent, but never enough. There's always more work to do. And Christians need to work to enlarge those forms that include and recognize the dignity of everyone. There is a danger, and this danger exists, I think, in many religious traditions, and I'll say a little bit about it in Orthodoxy. Maybe some of you can say something about it in your own religious or civil traditions. There's a danger for Christians in the Orthodox world to surrender to a kind of nostalgia for some long lost golden age, as if that expresses the ideal Orthodox polity. This, of course, is just a return to paganism, dressed up as if it was Christian. And it's a pernicious and false piety. Byzantine politics, current issues in the former Soviet Union countries, some evangelicals in the US and Canada, all often seek these days a privileged position for those who they define as Christian, and for the church as an institution within those societies. This is a big struggle in the churches, the Orthodox churches in the former Soviet Union these days. What do people do? Do they, now that the persecution is over, they want to claw back? They want to claw back what their privilege was that was so instrumental in why the revolution came about in the first place. It is a failure when this occurs to be properly anchored in a sense of the unfolding commonwealth of God, the unfolding ways in which love and solidarity can be extended. It's easy to mistake the transient political forms of the Orthodox past, whether it's the Byzantine Empire, for the essence of the church, binding the church to those crippling forms. This is simply another example of a great meta-narrative that runs through the Hebrew Bible of the idolatry of the state, of assuming somehow that the state deservedly can claim all that we are as human beings. It is, I think, important for people to love their own culture, to love their own tribe, to appreciate the gifts of their ethnic and national identities. It's not that that is not a good thing, but it has to be held properly. It must be a love which is large enough to contain also a generous sentiment and willingness to see the beauty and nobility of others and to welcome the engagement that comes about with those of other nations, other cultures, indeed other faiths. So patriotism, it's interesting to me, and I don't think I've ever noticed it before. Have you noticed that at the center of the word patriotism is the word riot? I don't know why I'd never seen that before, but it's striking, isn't it? I think we saw something like this fairly recently. Patriotism can be benign and wholesome as long as it is not mistaken for a virtue in and of itself. I remember my father on on, I think it used to be called Queen Victoria's birthday here in Alberta, when we would plant the garden. I remember him commenting on how odd he found it here in Canada, because as we were planting the garden, there would be airplanes, military aircraft would fly over the river valley, and you'd have a 21-gun salute. And I remember him saying, you know, sonny boy, you know, this isn't how we do it in Norway. In Norway, we bring Ole Bull, the violinist, to the public square. And we bring the storyteller who's been drunk for the whole year, waiting for this day, where he will tell us stories that deeply touch our heart. So a patriotism can be expressed in many, many forms. But it's false when one's country is engaged in those things that are unjust and destructive behavior towards its own citizens, towards strangers, and indeed towards other societies. So for Orthodox Christians, making an idol of culture, an idol of ethnicity, an idol of national identity is a tragedy that blinds one to the fullness of what we call the Commonwealth of God. To make an idolatry, even of one's own particular Christian vernacular, expression of the faith, as if it was the full and only expression of the faith, also strikes me, doesn't say this in the book, but it strikes me as also to miss something, and in that sense to be a tragedy. So there can be no such thing as Christian nationalism, or any nationalism really tolerable, any of this kind of hard nationalism that is tolerable for the Christian conscience. Racism is a form of blasphemy, and isn't it obviously so? There is one human race to which all belong, and to which we're all called as the people of God. It is a sad note that racism and nationalism have found a home in many Orthodox communities, as they have in many other religious communities. But then we are taught also that the devil is quite capable of making a nest in the church. When racism happens, there needs to be a call to a deep repentance. And where there is no willingness to do this, the document that we are discussing speaks one of its strongest words. It says that it needs to be exposed, it needs to be denounced, it needs to be expelled. The ecclesial community that fails to do this betrays Christ. But how to address this? How to address this when we see it, and when we see it among our brothers and sisters in the society, and particularly in the church? Our obligation, it seems to me, is to try our very best to find forms which can restore those who suffer from racism, restore them so that they see the whole of the world and not simply the image of God only in those that look like them. So whatever political arrangement Orthodox Christians find themselves in when they come out of having had the Eucharist, the communion, the divine liturgy, which holds up the world in all of its wonder, if they have actually entered in communion in that service, they then enter the world made new, eyes refreshed, seeing yet again the unfolding of what is eternal in life, and recognize all human beings as the bearers of the divine image. There is no place for efforts to advance the Christian faith through the use of political power or legal coercion. It is an old and still present temptation to do this, and it's acute in many places, and also, alas, in Orthodox countries and communities. When you do see this in the world, when we do see that, what do? How do we respond? So democracies are particularly vulnerable to the temptation to slander and to vilify those we disagree with. It's so troubling to me, the kind of political rhetoric we have in Canada and in so many other places, this kind of party rhetoric without any regard for actually trying to understand and contribute to an understanding of the issues. My sense is that we need to pull forward that commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. That needs to be done from all sides in order to enlarge our political discourse. Christians in political life need to strive to not do that and to always keep before them the commandment of love. Democracy, most of the rhetoric in our democratic sphere these days would lead you to believe that democracy is nothing but power politics, whereas in fact, it's quite something different than that. Human rights. Orthodox Christians should support the language of human rights, not because it is adequate in expressing all that is intended for human beings, but because it preserves a sense of the inviolable uniqueness of every human person and the priority of human goods over national and class interests, and provides the legal and ethical grammar through which we can strive for a political agreement associated with our common life as citizens, as opposed to simply our particular aspirations as Christians. Human rights is intended to heal divisions in the political community, in a political community where there are often deep differences. So my sense is that human rights legislation is one of the great gifts of the 20th century, despite the fact that it is also limited. One of the gifts of it, of course, as you all know, is that it helps us understand the dangers of the divine right of the majority. The divine right of kings, the divine right of particular classes of people, the divine right of the majority. All of these perspectives limit so much our ability to see the fullness of the human community. Pluralism. Neither should we fear the realities of social and cultural pluralism. Rather, we should rejoice in it, since it is one of the glories of our age, the dynamic confluence of human cultures. Our civil place and space needs to be open and welcoming to all, and the church needs to support policies that make this a reality of our common life. Gratitude to the God of all creation ought to be our response to the full flower of human cultures. The secular. We live in a secular age. This does not or ought not mean that religion is thoroughly privatized, as if that was ever possible. I have lots of friends that like to make this argument. They really are what I would call secular fundamentalists. They like to make this argument. And of course, it is an argument which runs exactly against the liberal notion of pluralism. But even in the most secularized societies of the West, religion remains vital in many spheres. We have to remember that the secular was a gift of the Roman Catholic Church to the West, given 1,000 years ago, a little over 1,000 years ago, given in that confrontation between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. It came about when the Pope said to the Emperor, "You can appoint the princes of this world. The princes of the church are in my sphere and under my dominion. If you appoint another bishop, you will by that act excommunicate yourself." And as you know, he did. They squared off, and it only took about 3 months before the emperor came in the snow, barefoot, to confession. That established a sense in the West that even in our shared public world, there are distinct spheres of authority. And those distinct spheres of authority are to be honored. This impulse to banish religion from the public square is something that I certainly have seen in my day. I mentioned the Swedish example. You can think of examples here in Canada, in the United States, and other parts of Europe. And there are many people that believe that democratic society is possible only to the degree that religion has been relegated to the private sphere entirely. And they allow no role for religions and religious people to engage in thinking about the policy of the society. That is, I think, a dangerous matter, and it quickly can lead to a kind of despotism. It certainly shaped the Soviet Union and China in the 20th century, gave us some of the most horrible killing in the world. But at the same time, how do Christians do that? How do they do it? What is their responsibility for doing that properly within the context of a secular and a pluralistic society? The ethical convictions of human beings never really evolve in a vacuum, and religious adherence is an inseparable part of how many communities, many persons come to have any notion at all of what is the common good, what constitutes a moral community, and where do our social responsibilities lie. So these are terribly important elements to be present in public discourse, but not to trump the public discourse. The dissolution of the ancient compact between the state and the church, between the throne and the altar, has been a blessing to the Christian community because it has freed the church from its alliance and from its unholy submission to earthly powers. I think North America of the evangelical tradition, which I appreciate so deeply, and its enormous contribution to the development of a healthy secular society coming out of the 18th century, to separate the established church from the state so that the church can do its proper work, and how odd it is to see so many evangelicals then engage in a restoration, in a kind of attempt to pull their perspective and themselves into a very tight association with political power, and for those political powers to use the church for its benefit. So the church's relationship to the state needs to be as tenuous as possible, not because the church seeks to withdraw from society, but because the church needs to be able to speak freely the word of the gospel to the world, and needs to serve God who made all things. So I think in this document, it must be one of the first times it was said in an official document of the church that the Orthodox Church should be thankful that God has allowed for the reduction of its political enfranchisement in most of the lands of ancient Christendom, freeing it to engage its mission and speak to the reason and conscience of everyone, seeking to turn enmity wherever it is found to empathy, and calling all into a deeper union. The church should also cooperate with the state, engage in direct and robust cooperation with civil authorities, organs of the state, to advance the common good and heighten the capacity to do the charitable works of life, and deepen the critique of those things that are structurally destructive in our lives. It's often important to remember that Christianity began as a minority culture within an imperial state that was often hostile to it. And in those periods, it engaged in selfless service to its neighbors, to the people it didn't know, to those who were desperate, and established some of the first social service agencies. I recall that, I believe it was Diocletian, who, when his Secretary of State came to him and told him that the people of the way were feeding the poor, Diocletian said, yeah, that's fine, they can feed their own poor. No, the Secretary of State says, they're feeding your poor. Your poor, not their own poor, not the Christian poor. They're feeding the pagan poor. And that infuriated the emperor. And he brought down one of the fiercest pogroms upon the early fledgling Christian communities. So the document suggests that there is an unfolding of the Christian conscience into the social grammar of the state in late antiquity, and now has proven an enormous good for the world. And I know that Andrew has been thinking about this question of conscience, so I hope he'll speak to it a little bit. In Orthodox theology, the cooperation of the church with the state for the sake of the common good was talked about as the doctrine of the symphonia. It's a lovely, lovely word to use. That developed in the time of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. This can continue to inform our understanding on matters of the common good, free of direct political power, and thus return it to its proper meaning. Alas, that doctrine of the Symphonia has all too often been used in my church to link the hierarchy of the church to the political hierarchy and ignore the society. The document goes on to say that this doctrine can never be invoked as a justification for the imposition of religious orthodoxy on a society at large, or for the promotion of the church as a political power. Rather, it should serve to remind Christians that this commitment to the common good, as opposed to the mere formal protection of individual liberties, religious interests, or other partisan interests, including those of the church, and the power of corporations, is the true essence of a democratic political order. I recall the head of the Lutheran college at McMaster University, David Frimmer, speaking in such a beautiful way about the public sphere, in which he had a sphere, and on each side a particular interest. So one side was politics, another was the economic sphere, a third one was religion, and a fourth one was NGOs. And Frimmer argued that a healthy public sphere can only exist when political, economic, religious, and NGO interests are all at play in the public area, are all at play in it. And that it becomes increasingly decadent when one of them colonizes that whole public space. And I would suggest that in our society, economic interests play such a large role and are so deeply bound up with politics that we have a somewhat disordered society as a result. If we look at a country like Iran, one might argue that religion dominates too much. So, just finally, the common life. We need the language of the common good. It needs to be at the center of our social life. It needs to be at the center of our thinking about democratic pluralism, where without that language, a language treasured, going all the way back to the first chapters of Genesis and the notion that God created the world and every human being as image and likeness. Without that language of the common good, our society becomes increasingly colonized, and our thinking becomes colonized by individualism, by a free market absolutism, and by the spiritually corrosiveness of thinking we are nothing but consumers. So, enough.
Enough in a sense, but in another sense, we're just beginning. Thank you, David. A really profound series of comments. If you don't mind, I'd like to say a couple of things, but really ask you to say a few more things. First of all, I'm glad we ended on the language of the common good, the language of human rights, the language of common accord. I know that you've thought about this and how you said it's not adequate to life. And I think that's a fair way of putting it. You've talked previously about how it fits into the cosmic hierarchy, the cosmic liturgy, to use these terms familiar from our tradition. I also like how you differentiated between interest, the interestedness, the being with other people in regard for them, and vested interest, which is my being imposing, informing on someone else. But I want to ask two things different than that. We can hold those in our minds, but perhaps to draw forth two threads, you said. They may hang together, I'm not sure. First, you talked about the prophetic stance of the church, a lovely phrase. And in the document itself, the text, they have the phrase, the prophetic vocation to proclaim and witness to God's justice and mercy in the world. That's in section 9, number section 9. We know that often the prophetic element of our tradition is seen as one of outreach, one of the of social good, of the common good. It can be our kind of impulse to reach out, to witness, to stretch out. We also know that and you hinted at this, the theology, the register of articulation of the church is coherent, it's integral. So we also talk about, your friend and one of my first teachers talks about Gaza, talks about the prophetic nature or the prophetic aspect of confession in the church, right? We can also, you mentioned the conscience, and it's been, I think actually you said that earlier, that the conscience has a kind of prophetic role in our lives. So the seamless integration of the prophetic in the church, that's one question. Maybe that's not the way to put it, but I'm offering it out there. The second question is, appreciate so deeply how you carefully navigate and hold and care for the ills that come when, as Christians, we go awry, particularly in the public sphere. One question, maybe a way into that, is what happens when we think we do well? So, for example, you referred to the line in the liturgy, "Put not thy trust in princes and sons of men," which we all chant. Pardon me. You spoke about the one invocation in the liturgical cycle, or the liturgy itself, maybe, which focuses in on justice. And you said that is immediately followed up by mercy, by the oil of mercy, by Kyrie eleison. We're aware of symphonia, that term, but when we think we've put aside all earthly care, when we think that our church is doing well with the state, when we think everything is fine, everything's well, we're speaking the truth. Where's that public danger? What happens there? Because it's not any simpler to say it's easy to identify, say, hateful behavior. It's an awful, awful thing. But it is simpler to discern, in a way, than when we think that we are saying the truth. We are standing in, as it were, for the voice of truth. I'm so pleased you brought up the idea of blasphemy. Blasphemy, this has come up before. Blasphemy can be understood as kind of, I don't know, cursing God or saying something deliberately untoward about the church or the spiritual life. It can also be, in a way, us standing in for God, my voice standing in. I'm mistaking myself for Christ. And I know this well because I do it frequently. But that's something, if you're willing, and if these can be drawn together, they might not be able to. But I'm curious, what happens when we think we're right as a church or individual? Because I think often a lot of the harm we do around some of these ideas or these realities, some of it is hateful, true, and that's awful. Some of it is from those of us who think we're doing the right thing, saying the right word. There's a briefly biblical parallel, which you pointed out to me years ago, with those who greeted Christ and then a few days later yelled, still sure that they were right, crucify him. That's kind of the nub of where I'm getting. But yeah. I'd like to open it up to you first, but then also for us to think about in general, because I think you raise such immensely interesting and provocative and spurring points. But either of those reflections, if anything stands out, comes to mind.
I think when we think we are right, we should hear that as the voice of our conscience, trying to get our attention. Because every time we think we are right, we have placed ourselves outside the dynamism of what is unfolding. We have stepped aside of the dynamism of life. So it's not that we should assume that what we think is right. It's not that we should, how can I put this? It's not that we should back off of it. I think, you know, I liked your comments on tone last week. It's what should our stance be when we think we are right? My sense is we should speak about it humbly. We should speak about it humbly. And we should speak about it tentatively, recognizing that we do not know or understand everything that is going on in the lives of our brothers and sisters, everything that is going on within our society, and why things are unfolding the way they should. So the prophetic stance well, let me just be a little more personal here. I've always been a little bit afraid of the notions of God's justice. I've always thought that was not something I wanted to be all that close to, because there's an old Russian proverb, you know, that God is far away in the heavens and the Tsar is far away in Moscow and all is well with the world. So for me, one of the delights of the Orthodox tradition is that, well, the word justice is there in the liturgy. I quoted it the only time it's there. The word mercy is there 147 times. And in the Christian East, I think I can say this, several of you can pick up on it if you wish. I think it's safe to say that in the Christian East, justice flows from mercy, not the other way around. And to me, that's a corrective, because mercy is a stance of recognition that there is suffering afoot, So instead of me getting on my high horse with my political rivals and making my arguments, often ad hominem, instead of doing that, try to hear the suffering in what they are saying. Trying to come at it in a way that recognizes something is at work here. Something's at work here. What is it? It's just way too easy to assume that the prophetic stance is a stance of righteousness. It needs to be the way in which we normally understand righteousness. But righteousness in the Bible, and justice as it's translated in the Bible so often, really means to restore, to bring back into proper relationship. It doesn't mean to be right, because in fact, I am never right. I only ever see things partially. So the prophetic stance, to my mind, ought to recognize the partialness with which we see. So in this sense, I think the church doesn't, when it comes to politics, I don't think the church has any special thing, has any special insight, but it does have a special stance. It has the stance of grace, of humility.
I like that, no insight, but a stance. Just one more step. If justice is not contrasted with mercy, or rather mercy is not contrasted with justice plainly as opposites, but justice means to bring to full restoration. That's a good sense of it. So mercy, you used the phrase the oil of gladness. Mercy is not being okay with injustice.
No, to the contrary.
What is mercy? Please.
It is to anoint the wound of the world. It is to recognize where you are in it, that you are part of it too. And it is to do everything you can do. And certainly in the Christian tradition, that includes laying down your own life for its healing, for its healing. So I think of my friend Steve Bynum and our discussions about race in North America, and how difficult it has been, how unbelievably difficult for white Christians, particularly white liberal Christians, to recognize their place within the kind of racism that so dominates our world. I remember having a moment of sudden delight a few years back when the Southern Baptist Convention elected a Black man to be the head of that church, after that church had spent its whole history insisting on the separation of the races, even at the worship service. Martin Luther King often said that 11 o'clock in the morning is the most racist moment in American society's life. And then I discovered that they had elected him because he was such a fierce critic of LGBTQ issues. So the danger of being deceived by your own sense of what is right and what is true, the danger of that is thorough. And anytime the temptation arises in us, it ought to be a warning to us. Be careful. Listen more deeply, more attentively. There's a wound here. There's a wound here. How do I find a way of anointing it instead of simply a way of declaring my own rightness in the face of it? Jesus Christ, as we know from the gospel, came not for the righteous. Came to heal, to make it possible for us to live in a deeper union with each other and transfigure the world.
Um, David, thank you for this. Andrew, both of you. I had a question. You had spoken about the issue of the necessity for human rights to be in the center of the Orthodox mind. And you had mentioned how it shines light on the uniqueness of humanity. Can you elaborate on that, how that runs up against North American exceptionalism, certainly more so in the United States, and then also the concept, the idea of how providence and manifest destiny dominated the political and religious political landscape of North America?
Well, Steve, you're the one who can talk about this. You know a lot about this. My response to my American friends, I don't have any difficulty with America's notion of its exceptionalism. Of course, it is an exceptional society. The problem isn't that. The problem is what they think it means. They think it's divine. And the moment you think it's divine, you're engaged in the age-old idolatry. It's just the same old idolatry. There is maybe a reason why Washington, D.C. looks like a Roman city. And you got a bunch of statues in the hall there. You know, it looks pretty familiar. So it's not the exceptionalism, the fact it's exceptional. It's the fact that this leads to thinking that you're the only ones who are exceptional, you know. So the idolatry of the state is, at least to my mind, very much in the saddle when it comes to political discourse in many, many democratic countries these days. We see it vividly, or at least I see it vividly in the discourse of right-wing movements, but people can see it pretty vividly also in the discourse of very left-wing and progressive movements. Anytime there's the assumption that my rightness is the whole picture, our rightness can never be the whole picture. So, you know, God bless America, but I did, just before we began, I did listen to Representative Jordan quote from 2 Timothy at the CPAC conference just before he introduced former President Trump, and the way in which he took the text from 2 Timothy about fighting the good fight, running the race, sticking it out to the last, and then his interpretation of this. His whole interpretation of this was classical paganism. Classical paganism. Because it assumes it's the state. So that's not an unusual thing.
To follow, Steve, pardon me. If you'd like to respond, please.
No, please go ahead.
I think this is maybe part of the same kind of thing. But we might think for a few minutes about the idea of a language of human rights or a common good. One thing that struck me when I was pondering it this week is that it can be conceived kind of as a blanket, like it's what we're meant to do. Everyone observe this standard in order that we're nicer in general to each other. seen as an imposition, as a falseness, as a screen in between me and the other person, one might resist it with good reason. Seen as a habit which may become us, as a kind of discipline of the mouth or discipline of the voice, which may become us in the sense that we begin to understand why this mode of expression or this way of addressing someone is worthwhile, might be akin to something like when we learn to pray, or when we utter things in unison together in a community. This is not something which might naturally feel like it is truly expressive of ourselves, but it's something which, through participation, like we referred to last week, the idea of participation, we're all responsible, we're all called to participate. As a discipline, like exercise or like a regime of diet or prayer or what have you, maybe it becomes us, while we still admit or recognize that it is finally inadequate, in the sense that every unique event, every unique encounter demands its own grace, its own, or really glory. If we are actually meeting Christ when we greet someone, and we say we do, most of us don't do this, but some of us do, then our presence to that person is, well, needs to be particular, needs to be tailored, cultivated for that one encounter, more than general. So the distinction between a general, let's say, stance and particular realization, that might be something, it's an idea I had that I thought it would be nice to open up, to talk about. Because the language of human rights is, as David pointed out, and many of us have know or have articulated, it's immensely important. And that doesn't mean that we don't either see its genius and its delimitations as well. A thought.
In the document, this is, I think, making an argument towards Orthodox churches, where there's been a resistance to the language of human rights, precisely because there are human rights that compete with each other. The right to religious freedom and the right to freedom of association, the right to free speech, these things collide with each other. And so it's made there, and I think quite carefully made, to say this is a terribly significant language for our common social life. This is never enough, not nearly enough, for the life of the church or the life of the faithful. As you, I think we're pointing to here, Andrew. Rights is a legal matter in the social sphere. I often try to illustrate this with my students by saying, I have 4 children. If I loved all my children equally, I would be the author of child abuse. Because equality is a political term. Rights in this sense is a political term. But in the church, what we endeavor to have cultivated within us, in and through the liturgy and the disciplines of the church, is the clarity of presence, so that you respond to every human being as the image of God, full of a mystery which is beyond measure, and to be utterly regarded, not simply regarded the way in which human rights regards them, but that's terribly important in the society, but utterly regarded.
I am in the habit of falling over myself if I say that I have a right. I give in consideration that I can say that the other person has a right, but then I have a duty.
Beautiful.
So therefore, rights is not common. They are on the receiving end, but they cannot speak about it. The giver has to speak about the rights of the others and about the duties put on himself.
Thank you, Cor.
One of the things I really liked about this section of the book was that the way in which it provided a language to talk about democracy and human rights in a way that I've often found difficult in speaking with some of my co-religionists, to talk about the particular way in which human dignity can be expressed within democracies. Some of my Roman Catholic friends, I mean, I've known people who really kind of take the view that Francisco Franco is a kind of model of Christian leadership, that a state that isn't burning heretics at the stake is somehow negligent in its duties. And if you mention human rights, we'll tend to quote Pope Pius IX that error has no rights. And a lot of the language about democracy and human rights that certainly has been kind of in the Catholic Church, and I think in the Anglican Church as well, kind of since the mid 20th century, has been about accommodating the modern world. What I liked about this book is that it doesn't take that tack. It talks about the way in which this idea of intrinsic individual human dignity is a central Christian perspective, and hence from that things like racism are rightly seen as blasphemy. So I think it's a very good tack to take. I then found myself wondering, well, is this particular to certain kinds of liberal democracy, that this alignment between the individual liberty and in a kind of political sense and human dignity in a Christian sense? Is it something, is that why we should be embracing democracy, which is, a contingent historical political system? Or should we be looking for the ways in which human dignity can find value and expression in all, any arbitrary contingent political system? I mean, it's an idea that in some way flourished in feudalism in the West, perhaps more so than it did in post-feudal kind of early modern and early capitalist society. I don't know if there was a question in there.
Oh, but a lovely comment and point.
David, I'd like to say a word about the prophetic. I don't know what the role in the Eastern Orthodox. I don't necessarily find myself in that tradition. I'm finding the conversation in the book fascinating, though. And I wonder what the role is of the prophetic in the Eastern Orthodox Church, like what the history is there. Because when you ask a question like, what's a prophetic stance in the world? for the church, and not being siding with any particular party. I just think that there's something to the voice of the prophetic all throughout Scripture, and even Jesus when he comes in Luke 4. And I think there's a sort of laying out of what justice would look like. And I think that there's a unique voice and stance for the Christian in the world that has access to the heart of God and the responsibility of the proclamation of that justice. So I don't know. It just sounds to me like maybe there's particular people who have the gifts of prophecy. Maybe it's not a complete Christian, every Christian stance type of thing, but the voice expressing of the heart of God into the world is absolutely unique. So I don't know. I'm finding myself a little frustrated. I'm not quite sure why, but it sounds almost like capitulating with the system of the world if we're wondering how we should operate within democracy. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Well, if I read the document right, the prophetic stance is the recognition and the seeking a way to speak to any and all situations in which human beings or creation herself are being marred. The ecumenical patriarch who was behind this, of course, has taken that up in a vigorous way around issues of the environment and climate, issues of refugees and people fleeing to try and find a better way of life. So I don't think there's any question about what is meant here about the prophetic stance. It is that critical stance which we see written so large in the prophetic books of the Bible, where it's mostly reading the riot act to emperors or to your own king or to your own ecclesiastical hierarchy. That's what they were up to. That's the sort of models that are there. I would say this, Adam. I grew up in the Lutheran Church, and there's a sense in which the Lutheran Church really treasured the prophets, really treasured the epistles of the apostle, the Apostle Paul. They were sort of central, and I would say that in general, the Protestant church, that is the church of protest, the church of prophets, there's so much about that wing and that period in the development of the church, which put so much weight on that prophetic dimension of human life. The Eastern Christian Church has a different history, and I would say it has lots to learn from this wing, from the Protestant wing of the church around these matters. A lot to learn around it. If I think of our own country, Canada, I would say that the United Church of Canada carried the water around the prophetic work in the country far more than any other church did. There's been a lot done by Catholics in the last 50 years as well, but it carried a lot of the water in our country around this. And I think other churches didn't do nearly enough. So the Eastern Christian Church, at least formally, tries to hold together praise and wonder, as well as the call to speak the healing word. But it does tend to shape it as a healing word, which can lead some, both within the church and without, to think that it's not vigorous enough. So I think you maybe are picking up on the fact that this is a document coming out of the Orthodox world, and your own familiarity with the Protestant world has that prophetic, critical edge at the very center. I would also say that it is my sense is that the Achilles heel of those who settle into and see and come to think that the whole of the gospel is the prophetic stance, who really just see Jesus Christ as prophet, not as king or as Messiah. My sense has been that in some cases, they end up in a kind of spiritual anorexia. I treasure how they speak and how they try to help bring that criticism to issues in our society, and that's a gift. But there's always a danger if you divorce the good and the true from their third sister, the beautiful. Because if you divorce them, you are not likely, if you don't have beauty in your life, or what the church talks about as doxology, if you don't have worship in your life, the danger is that you won't be able to sustain the race. As human beings, those three transcendentals are there for a reason. There are three dimensions of our life, all of which need to be nurtured. All of which need to be nurtured. But I appreciate your critical position there.
Thank you. Thanks for the response.
Can I tie that perhaps back to something that Andrew said when he was talking about, at least what I understand him to be talking about, that open persecution is a state in which you kind of know where you stand. And in much of the world, the relationship of the church to the state is sort of an unknown. It's sort of presumed that everything's kind of ticking along okay, but it isn't until you come to some kind of point of contention, conflict, that you actually know what the state thinks of you, and what the state might be willing to do to you. And obviously that varies very much by different countries across the world. My understanding, for instance, in modern Turkey, is that the Turkish government has said that the position of ecumenical patriarch can only be held by someone who is born in Turkey. Mm-hmm. So that is the state directly involving itself in the life of the church. David, you spoke about the idea of spiritual anorexia coming out of a an overemphasis on this prophetic and critical stance. I think another thing that can sometimes happen is you get, particularly in smaller sects, the sense that unless you're being persecuted, you're doing something wrong. The persecution is the sign of faithfulness and the sign even of what they would consider orthodoxy.
Confirmation.
Yeah. Hmm.
May I speak a little bit and say something here?
We hear you.
Oh, I was not sure. So,
Please go ahead, please.
Thank you. Just thinking back of one of the first questions you had, David, about how Christian can do what they have to do in regards to doing their best in healing and being present. And the state and the church were together at some point, and I'm very afraid when in our neighbors in the south, they seem to be again a tandem, some sort of the political discourse tends to be more and more inclusive of the religious, which for me is a little bit of a scary place because in history it has never been good. However, if we look at what happened and why the secular society is to some extent rejecting the church, it might be that there is something that has to be done that should respond to the needs of people, and that is not addressed or given by anyone, neither the state, neither the church as it is now. And I wonder if it comes from the fact that we speak of those things as the state, the church, like the political discourse is talking about the people. And we put people and the church and the state as external subjects and objects of our thinking without having any conversation about what do we do with our neighbors, with the people we know, with one another, with not the people, but the people we know, the people we talk with, the people we work with. And I don't know if that way of speaking about those things as if they were external and subjective things is creating that divide, is creating that gap that nobody, neither the state, neither the church are able to bridge. I don't know.
Interesting. So we sort of massify both the notions of state and the notions of church, and that we should be more careful around that because the church as well as the state are, we never see them in a satisfactory way if we massify them. We have to understand that that's not quite what they are. They are more organic than we commonly assume. Is that part of what you're suggesting?
Yes, it's part of it because I've heard so much recently the notion of the people as being used as some sort of propaganda around political jargon that wants to portray an attentiveness to the needs of the people. But to some extent, it creates the opposite because it creates that distance and that objectification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The general or the common always needs to be made particular. If I may just harken back to something that well, Sylvie said and John said a moment ago. It is curious when what we find when we think that we are sure what a word means or should mean. The church, the state, persecution, freedom, this kind of thing. The refreshing or renewing of our some of our central terms, concepts, ideas, commitments, convictions. It's a healthy thing to pause and to ask, what's going on here? With prophecy, for example, what does that mean when we say the word prophetic? What does it mean? What do we mean when we say church, the church, or the common good, or hospitality, or charity? These are not real questions. They're rhetorical questions, but the kind of thing, it can be useful to return to these concepts we hold dearest to our hearts and think, all right, so charity is next to me. What do I understand by charity? What does the church understand? What does our history understand? What do those I love understand? In that renewal, that finding of ourselves again, there may be something, a key, a clue, a hint to a more fulsome approach. It's 4:45. David, do you have 4:45 my time? Pardon me. It's 1:45 across the board. Would you like to say a few words, David, to conclude?
Well, it's lovely to hear each of you, and it always seems that we don't have enough time to talk, but we do have some more sessions, so we will be able to develop some of your ideas more. Next week, we will be looking at the section which is called The Course of Human Life. And this is an area similar to the one today, where there have been a fair bit of contested matters. But it looks, of course, at children, at the sexual life, at family, and a whole range of those issues. So I hope you have a chance to read it and that you can come and think with us about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David, for a beautiful presentation today. Sorry, John, did you have I saw a hand up. Is that a wave? Okay, waving is appropriate too. Thank you all very much.
I wish, John, you would wave like Pope Francis or Pope Benedict.
All right.
I'll have to study
until
that.
next week. Until next week. Ciao. Thank you. Peace.